Well, guys, this is actually kind of exciting. It's our first student seminar in Australia for someone who's presenting work outside of the ATC. Marcus submitted a paper to a conference in Korea and is telling us what he's writing about and practicing as well. So give him a hard time.
Take your hands off your pockets.
So this is a presentation that I'm giving in Korea. I am very interested in feedback and discussion, so please take notes on how horrible I am. Let's see what my name is Barrett. I am a student at the Entertainment Technology Center in Carnegie Mellon's Entertainment Technology Center in Adelaide, Australia. And my presentation is about the next step that I foresee happening in narrative-based video games, a proposal for a next step. My goal in starting out and giving this presentation is to define what it is that narrative-based video games are uniquely good at doing vis-a-vis other forms of dramatic art or narrative art. You know, we can sort of see from long experience that novels are really good at communicating the consciousness of characters. So if you want insight into a character's mindset, a novel is a really good place to get it. Likewise, theater is really good at a sort of communal catharsis. You have a sense that there's a community watching an actual individual undergoing change in real time. You get a sense then of the importance of change in characters. Theater is very good at that experience. Film is very good at spectacle. It's also very good at sort of an immersive experience that stems from the passivity of the film as an experience. My question then is, what is it that video games are uniquely good at, and how do we maximize that in the work that we do? So, to not really answer that question at all, I'm going to begin the presentation with a poem. The poem, I hope, will give a representation of what it is that I hope to achieve through this paper and what it is that I'm proposing, more or less, in sort of metaphorical terms. The poem is probably the most famous work by a mid-20th century American poet, Robert Frost. It's called The Road Not Taken. Two roads diverged in a yellow wood, and sorry I could not travel both. But the one traveler long I stood, then looked down one as far as I could to where it bent in the undergrowth. Then took the other just as fair, and having perhaps the better claim, for it was grassy and wanted wear, though as for that the passing there had worn them really about the same. And both that morning equally lay, in leaves no step had trodden black. Oh, I saved the first for another day, though knowing how way leads on to way, I doubted I should ever be back. I shall be telling this with a sigh, somewhere ages and ages hence. Two roads diverged in a wood, and I chose the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. So the idea in this paper is to give a guest, an audience member, the chance to move through a world, a narrative-based video game world, and to have that world be as satisfying and as complete as Frost's poem, and to give the guest that kind of choice that the audience talks about, that the work talks about, and have them go all the way through, get to that decision, be able to look back across the ages and ages and say, this is what that choice yielded. And then, after the work is finished, to give them the chance to go back to the very beginning, to that choice, and to take the other road, the road more traveled. That's what this whole presentation is going to be aiming towards eventually. But before we get there, I have to define some terms. A number of terms come from Janet Murray's work, Hamlet on the Holodeck. In it, she defines three attributes she sees coming as the major elements of the sort of digital non-linear narrative that is going to be the major growth area of art for the foreseeable future. The first term is one that I'm including mostly for completeness sake. Immersion is the capacity of a work to suck
an audience into its world and to make them forget the world around them. It isn't terribly relevant for the discussions here. However, agency, the second term that she defines, is narrative-based video games as a form have the capacity to make agency matter. And agency is simply the ability for the choices of the guest or the audience member to affect the world of the work. In plays and other works, Romeo and Juliet are always going to die at the end of Shakespeare's play. That isn't necessarily the case in narrative-based video games, and it is up in some sense to the guest, to the audience member potentially, to decide their fate. That's the cool thing about narrative-based video games. That's the cool thing about agency, and it's a strong thing. It's a thing that we should very much keep in mind for narrative-based video games in the future. Transformation is the third of her terms, and it's the most complicated of the three. It sort of has two definitions. She tries to give it two definitions at once. The first of all is the character becoming, rather the audience member becoming a character in a work and having a lot of sympathy with the character. In other contexts, it's merely referred to as sympathy, where you're watching a play and you have a lot of sympathy with the people who are on stage, or you're reading a book and you have the same thing. In the case of games, however, with the advent of agency, you do have the ability for the player's choices to be represented in the actions of the character there. So the choices of the player become the reality of, the choices of the audience member become the reality of the character. That's a new thing and an interesting thing, and it sort of ratchets up the importance of transformation. The second attribute, and the more interesting of the two, for my money, is the chance for the experience to encompass multiple perspectives within a given work. So you have not only one path through a work, but you have a multitude of different options, different ways of viewing the world of the work. That's an interesting attribute, and some of the most interesting and innovative games that have been made recently speak strongly to this capacity for transformation, the multiple perspectives within a work. Basically, transformation then in this context refers to, if an aesthetic for video games is the ability to have a guest be able to be anyone and do anything they want, transformation basically refers to the first half of that. It's the concept of being anyone in the world of a work. The final definition I want to give is just for a narrative work of art, and I'm actually going to cop out on giving a strict definition. I'll leave that to an actual academic, but these are just examples of various forms of works of art. You have film and novels, theater and narrative-based video games, even the sort of basic storytelling of the epic story, the oral storytelling of Homer, along with the more contemporary Homer that we've got, who runs a small TV show these days. All of these works feature what should be a very familiar form, the dramatic arc. And in the dramatic arc, just to review, as you move along the course of a work, tension is raised, complications are introduced until you get to the high point, a climax, at which point the action, that's the moment of greatest tension, the action at that point sort of falls off, you move into a denouement, and then finally come to some conclusive, satisfying ending. And it's the concept of an ending that I'd really like to focus on in this, because endings do present a certain number of problems for narrative-based video games as a form. This is an extended quote from an article in the San Francisco Chronicle compiled by a reporter named Stephen Wynn. Basically what it says is that endings are really, really important. Getting a good ending to any sort of narrative work of art is critically important. In fact, in terms of works of narrative art, it is the most important section of, it has a disproportionate impact on the work as a whole. Really good works that have mediocre endings really suffer because of it, and otherwise mediocre works that have tremendous endings, you remember a lot more. They have, the work as a whole is much more impressive. And so he talks about this ability for a work to be disappointing at the end, and the endings are just very, very hard for all forms of art. The trouble is that it gets